05:14 a.m. on December 17, 1944, in a freezing valley on the northern edge of the Ardennes, Private Harold Burns stood alone in a collapsed Belgian barn, gripping a dented frying pan as if it were a weapon. Outside, boots crunched against icy soil, slow, methodical, the confident steps of men who believed they were hunting a coward. The snow muffled everything except Harold's heartbeat, a frantic pulse rattling up his throat. He tasted iron. He tasted fear. Light leaked through the broken slats of the barn wall, thin and gray. The temperature had dropped so sharply overnight that frost formed on his eyelashes every time he blinked. He could hear German voices barking orders, each one getting closer, each one echoing through his ribs like blows from a hammer. Harold had no rifle, no ammunition, no training that would save him now. Only a pan blackened by months of cooking for men who thought he was useless anywhere else. And yet, for the first time since the war began, Harold was exactly where he needed to be. A shadow crossed the gap beneath the barn door. A boot brushed aside a loose board. Someone muttered something short and annoyed. Harold raised the pan, muscles trembling, breath fogging out in quick, frantic bursts. He pressed his back against a support beam, forcing himself to inhale slowly, quietly, like he'd practiced in the kitchen when timing dough rising by the rhythm of his breath. He didn't know the names of the Germans searching for him, but he knew the crates he'd destroyed last night belonged to them. He knew the supply wagons he'd sabotaged would be discovered by morning. And he knew that when the explosion tore through their fuel depot just before dawn, an explosion triggered by a fuse he'd hidden inside a flour sack, they'd scour the nearest structures for the saboteur. Harold hadn't expected they'd respond this quickly, or this aggressively. Snow showered down as the barn door groaned open, pushed by the muzzle of a rifle. Harold froze, feeling splinters digging into his spine. The sickly gray light outside stretched across the barn's interior like a slow tide. A soldier stepped inside, his breath clouding the air. He moved with the caution of a man checking for traps, but not enough caution, Harold thought, to expect a cook hiding in the rafters or behind beams. Harold saw the soldier's fingers relax on the rifle, as if bored, as if annoyed that this mission would inconvenience him when surely, no real enemy was here. That arrogance saved Harold's life. The soldier turned his head toward the overturned feed trough. Harold moved, not bravely, not boldly, instinctively like a mouse scrambling from the shadow of a boot. He swung the frying pan upward. The crack was wet and sharp, slicing through the barn's silence. The soldier collapsed. Harold hadn't killed him. He could tell by the way the man's chest still rose and fell in shallow, shocked breaths. But he had seconds, no more. Footsteps outside paused. A voice called out. Another answered. Harold dragged the unconscious man behind a stack of rotting hay bales and knelt over him, trembling so hard he could barely keep the pan from slipping in his grip. His breath shuddered. His thoughts raced. How many were outside? 3? 5 more? He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be anything except a cook who followed orders and kept his head down. But 6 months of working behind enemy positions had carved something else inside him, something he didn't fully understand. A stubborn streak. A quiet defiance, the knowledge that the war wasn't always won by the strongest men but sometimes by the least expected ones. Another boot crossed the threshold. Harold pressed himself deeper into the shadows. His heart hammered so violently he feared the sound alone would betray him. He clutched the pan like a lifeline. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the distant thud of artillery. Inside, the barn creaked again as another pair of boots entered. Harold was outnumbered, unarmed, exhausted. And there, in the frozen dark of the Ardennes, Private Harold Burns realized something terrifying and irreversible. He was going to have to finish what he started. Even if it meant facing them all. Even if it meant he wouldn't survive the next 60 seconds. Before the snow, before the frying pan, before the Ardennes swallowed him whole, Harold Burns grew up in a place where danger came not from artillery but from silence. The kind of silence that lingers after a father storms out of a room. The kind that makes a boy flinch at footsteps on the porch. The kind that teaches a child to navigate conflict not by meeting it head-on, but by slipping around it, the way water bends around stone. He was born in 1923 in a sagging clapboard house on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, a town bruised by the Great Depression long before the rest of the country felt its weight. His father worked odd jobs at the rail yard, or said he did. Most days he simply disappeared. His mother stitched torn shirts for neighbors, humming tunelessly to drown out the worry that gnawed at her. They lived frugally, eating whatever could be stretched, boiled, or reinvented. That was where Harold first learned to cook, not as a hobby but as survival. His mother handed him tasks that kept his small hands busy while the world outside cracked and splintered. Chop these onions, mix that dough, stir the pot and don't let it burn. The kitchen became the only place where sound felt safe, the pop of grease, the scrape of spoons, the steady, reliable rhythm of something warm taking shape. He discovered early that feeding people softened them, even his father. On rare nights when the man returned home sober, Harold would set down a pan of cornbread, and for a few fleeting minutes the house felt almost normal. His father would grunt approval without looking up, but for Harold that grunt meant everything. It meant he mattered in a world that rarely said so. School offered no refuge. Harold was small, narrow-shouldered, the kind of kid bullies enjoyed testing. He learned avoidance more than defiance: slip out a side door, take the back staircase, volunteer to help the cafeteria ladies if it meant staying out of sight. He became good at passing unnoticed, blending in, observing, a boy-like that grows instinct before he grows courage. But there was one place where Harold felt less invisible: the neighborhood bakery run by an elderly Polish immigrant named Mrs. Zaworska. She wasn't gentle, but she was honest. "Your hands are soft," she told him the first time she caught him watching her knead dough through the window. "Soft hands make careful bread. Come inside." She taught him the language of flour and timing, of heat and patience. She corrected his mistakes without scolding, guiding him with a firm hand on his wrist. More importantly, she gave him something Harold had never felt before: competence. The knowledge that he could create something consistent, something good, something that made people's faces soften the moment they tasted it. By the time he was 16, Harold had become her unofficial apprentice. He arrived before dawn, dusted with flour by sunrise, slipping home before school to hide the smell of yeast in his clothes. Those mornings shaped him more than he realized. The discipline of exact measurements, the calm required to follow a process from start to finish, the confidence to improvise when ingredients ran short. Where other boys dreamed of baseball or the open road, Harold dreamed of a warm kitchen and a shelf full of recipes that made sense even when the world didn't. But as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, the world outside Dayton began to tilt. Newsreels showed fires on continents Harold had only read about. Whispered conversations drifted through the bakery, words like Hitler, invasion, draft. Mrs. Zaworska listened with the hollow-eyed stillness of someone who had fled Europe once and feared she'd never escaped it completely. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Harold's life veered sharply. Men he knew only vaguely enlisted overnight. Posters appeared in town squares, all bold letters and pointing fingers. Even his unreliable father straightened his shoulders and muttered something about doing his part. Harold watched the tide sweep across the country with an inevitability he didn't question until it reached his own doorstep. He didn't want to fight. He wasn't built for it, but patriotism carried a momentum that crushed hesitation, and soon enough, 18-year-old Harold found himself standing in a line of boys signing enlistment forms they barely understood. He told himself he would find a way to help without hurting anyone. Maybe they needed bakers overseas, maybe he could stay behind the lines. But fate doesn't negotiate. Fate drafts who it chooses. And fate had already decided that the boy who could quiet storms with a warm loaf of bread would soon face a different kind of fire, one measured not in ovens but in miles of frozen forest and enemy patrols. The army saw his soft hands and scrawny frame and assumed he would break. Harold feared they were right. He didn't yet know that it was precisely those qualities, his invisibility, his gentleness, his instinct for reading people, that would turn him into the most improbable weapon of the war. Fort Benning hit Harold like a hammer, hot, noisy, relentless. Training yards stretched across red Georgia clay, and every morning the air vibrated with shouted orders, marching feet, and the metallic clatter of rifles Harold would never truly understand. He had imagined the army as structured and predictable, something like a kitchen with louder tools. Instead, he found chaos disguised as discipline. He learned quickly that boot camp exposed weakness the way boiling water exposes flaws in dough. The first time he touched an M1 Garand, it kicked back so hard it bruised his shoulder for days. The second time he dropped it during a firing drill. After the third failure, a sergeant stared at him with a kind of frustrated pity, an expression Harold had seen many times in childhood. But pity wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the smirking, the muttered jokes. The way some of the other recruits called him Butterfingers or Chef Boy, nicknames that clung to his uniform like grease. Harold tried to laugh along, hoping humor might soften the edges, but every joke sharpened the truth he already knew: he didn't belong out here. One afternoon during marksmanship tests, he fired 7 rounds and hit nothing, not a silhouette, not a berm, not even the sky in the right direction. When the range officer finally took the rifle from his hands, he muttered, "Son, the enemy is safer when you're armed." Harold wanted to disappear. He wanted to be back in Dayton in the bakery with flour dusting the air like soft snowfall, but the army didn't allow disappearing. They reassigned him instead. He was sent to the mess hall where they dumped a crate of potatoes in front of him and told him to peel until the pile vanished. It took hours. Harold didn't complain. For the first time since leaving home, he felt competent. He knew the rhythm of peeling, the subtle rollover of the blade, the meditative pace that made his breath slow and his shoulders loosen. Word spread quickly through camp that the scrawny kid with the hollow stare could cook better than the entire mess staff combined. Soon he was preparing biscuits for officers, soups for exhausted corporals, and pies that quieted even the loudest barracks. The kitchen became his zone of operations, the only place where no one barked at him to run faster or shoot straighter. But the army, in its own strange way, noticed something else about him, something beyond cooking. They noticed how easily he moved between groups, how forgettable he became when he wasn't behind a stove. He blended into the background, overheard things unintentionally, slipped past officers who barely registered his presence. He could walk through a doorway and leave no imprint. In a war ruled by visibility, flags, uniforms, borders, Harold possessed an unusual advantage: invisibility. One night, a captain from the intelligence detachment visited the kitchen while Harold ladled stew. The man dropped a folder onto the counter and watched Harold with a curious, measuring look. Harold recognized the expression. It was the look bakers gave dough when checking if it would rise. "We've got a logistical assignment," the captain said. "Not combat, more like observation, behind the lines, quiet work." Harold blinked. Quiet he could do, quiet he was built for. The captain continued, lowering his voice. "We need someone who can pass as non-threatening, someone who can enter places soldiers aren't expected to enter." He paused. "Someone like you." Harold's stomach tightened. "Sir, I can barely fire a rifle." "That's the point," the captain said. "The Germans won't see you as a threat, they'll see you as a cook, a servant, someone allowed near supply depots, kitchens, wagons, someone they ignore." The idea terrified him, but it also lit a spark, small but steady. For the first time, someone didn't see his weaknesses as burdens, they saw them as tools. Over the next month, while other recruits drilled with weapons, Harold trained in a different battlefield: kitchens, warehouses, foraging sites, and field logistics. He studied the layout of German supply chains, memorized the insignia of enemy units, learned bits of conversational German from an instructor who had lived near Dayton, Ohio before immigrating. He practiced moving quietly, watching, carrying crates without inspection, blending into work details with his head down and his manner deferential. He became, in essence, a ghost, one whose weapon was timing, instinct, and opportunity. His official transfer orders arrived the same week. Newsreels played images of the attack on Pearl Harbor and speeches warning about the growing menace of Adolf Hitler. Harold felt history pressing against his back like a closing door. He wasn't a fighter, he wasn't brave, but maybe bravery wasn't what the war needed from him. Maybe it needed someone like him, someone who could slip through cracks, read a room, and never be where the enemy expected. His deployment orders came with a final line scribbled in pencil: placement, forward logistics, observation, undisclosed operations potential. Harold didn't know what that meant, not yet. But soon he would, and the first operation waiting for him would drag him straight into the cold mouth of enemy territory. And there would be no turning back. The assignment that would define Harold Burns arrived on a rain-slick morning in early June 1944, just days before the chaos of Normandy would reshape Europe. A lieutenant from the Logistics Command approached him during breakfast prep, his boots leaving muddy prints across the mess hall floor. He didn't bother with introductions. Instead, he slid a thin envelope across the counter, tapping it twice with 2 fingers, an unspoken signal Harold had learned to recognize, orders too sensitive to say aloud. Inside was a map of a Belgian forest near the border with occupied territory. Red pencil marked a small crossroads, a cluster of buildings, and a long rectangular structure labeled Feldküche 17, German Field Kitchen. Below it, a second mark identified a supply depot feeding the nearby rifle battalions preparing for a counteroffensive. A handwritten note indicated the stakes. Intelligence confirms ammo convoys move nightly through this position. Sabotage or obstruction may delay enemy operations by 48-72 hours. Objective, infiltration and disruption. Non-combat operative preferred. There was no signature, no official stamp, just a location, an expectation, and the quiet implication that failure would cost American lives. Harold felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't observation. This was action behind enemy lines among trained soldiers who wouldn't hesitate to shoot a suspected saboteur. He imagined the smell of diesel, the clatter of ration tins, the rhythms of an enemy kitchen. He could picture himself slipping between wagons, keeping his head down, wearing the right uniform, moving with the same weary posture as any field cook. He could do this, or at least he thought he could. His handler, a captain from intelligence who rarely spoke above a whisper, briefed him that afternoon in a dim tent lit by a single lantern. No names were exchanged. "Your advantage," the captain said, "is that the Germans don't expect sabotage to come from someone in an apron. They'll assume you are harmless. Let them assume." Harold studied the map. The terrain was dense, with pine forests cresting over ridges and a narrow road curling like a scar through the trees. Visibility was low. Night movement would be easier, but tracking patrols would be harder. The plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Move under cover of darkness, infiltrate the crossroads posing as a cook attached to a foraging detail, and disrupt the flow of supplies from the inside. There was a secondary objective, almost casually mentioned. A German officer rumored to carry critical dispatches often visited the kitchen at dawn. If Harold had the opportunity to interrupt that chain of command, even briefly, it could buy the Allies precious time. 3 hours later, dressed in scavenged enemy work clothes and carrying a small crate filled with cooking tools and forged documents, Harold slipped into the forest with 2 guides who would escort him to the border and no further. They moved silently beneath the canopy, their breaths pale ribbons in the night. Harold felt the weight of every step, every pine needle crunching beneath his boots. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. At the rendezvous point, an old, moss-covered boundary marker, the guides halted. 2 kilometers that way, one whispered, pointing through the trees. "You'll hear them before you see them." Then, with a brief nod, they vanished back into the dark, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts and a knot tightening in his stomach. He adjusted his pack and advanced slowly. Soon, faint sounds drifted toward him, metal scraping, low voices, the unmistakable hiss of boiling water. A kitchen, a real one, busy, structured, familiar, and deadly in the wrong hands. Harold approached with the posture of a man exhausted from marching, his shoulders slumped, eyes down. He clutched the crate the way German cooks did in training films, close to the chest, elbows angled in. When a sentry challenged him, Harold handed over the forged paperwork with shaking hands that passed convincingly as nerves rather than fear. The sentry barely glanced at him. Cooks were invisible, they always had been. Inside the field kitchen, lanterns glowed through canvas walls as men stirred pots of barley stew and stacked crates for morning distribution. The air smelled of onions, grease, and cold iron. Harold felt the old familiarity rise in him, the rhythm of a kitchen, even one belonging to the enemy. He could predict which cook would leave his station to fetch more water, which sergeant would bark at the helpers for leaving knives unsharpened. He watched, listened, calculated. His mission was sabotage, but he couldn't rush. Kitchens were ecosystems. One wrong move and suspicion would crackle through the ranks like lightning. He moved from task to task quietly, slipping a hand into a ration crate long enough to plant a small fuse wrapped inside a flour pouch. Later, when reassigned to help unload fuel drums, he loosened a cap just enough to guarantee a leak. Every action tiny, unnoticeable, accrued like drops filling a basin. And then, as dawn began to stain the horizon, the officer arrived, the one mentioned in his briefing. Tall, rigid posture, coat lined with frost, he entered the kitchen alone. This was the moment, the fulcrum. Harold swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. The officer stepped inside the field kitchen with the crisp authority of a man accustomed to obedience. His boots struck the wooden floorboards in sharp, controlled beats. Frost clung to his greatcoat, glittering under the lantern light like fragments of broken glass. Harold felt the temperature in the tent shift, not physically but atmospherically. Men straightened. Conversations clipped short. Even the pot stopped clattering as if the flame itself stiffened at attention. Harold kept his gaze low the way real German cooks did around officers, but he watched everything from the corner of his eye. The officer carried a leather satchel strapped tight beneath his arm. Dispatches, orders, maybe troop movements, maybe worse. The air smelled of boiled barley and metal. Outside, a truck engine coughed to life, shuddering in the cold. Inside, tension pooled like spilled oil, thin, invisible, volatile. A plan formed in Harold's head with the sudden clarity that sometimes came to him when baking. The moment when ingredients aligned, when the mixture reached the exact consistency, when timing mattered more than force. This was no different. The kitchen was his battleground. Its chaos, its noise, its predictable routines, this was where he thrived. The officer removed his gloves with the sharp, economical movements of a man who disliked wasting seconds. He reached for a mug of coffee cooling on a nearby crate. Harold saw the opportunity open, not a door, not a window, but a small crack in the rhythm of the room. A cook approached the officer to present the morning ration logs. Harold followed, carrying a sack of flour he pretended was heavy enough to demand both arms. As he stepped closer, he stumbled, not accidentally, but with the precise, practiced awkwardness of a man who'd spent his whole life quieting conflict rather than confronting it. The sack burst open at the bottom seam Harold had weakened minutes earlier. Flour exploded upward into a white cloud, engulfing the officer and the nearest cooks. The room erupted in startled shouts. Men swatted at their faces, blinded. The officer cursed, stumbling back, one hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. That was Harold's opening. He slid forward, quick and silent, blending into the swirling white haze. His hands closed around the officer's wrist, twisting hard, not to break it but to disrupt his grip. The pistol clattered to the ground, buried instantly beneath a drift of flour. The officer choked on dust, reaching for the satchel. Harold grabbed it first. 2 seconds, that was all he had, maybe less. Someone yelled, a lantern toppled, boots scraped on wood. Harold darted through the haze and into the rear supply alcove, clutching the satchel to his chest. His lungs burned as he inhaled flour-thick air. He heard confusion outside, cooks arguing, soldiers rushing in, officers demanding answers. He had to move, now. He slipped out the back flap of the tent just as a rifle-shot command cracked through the chaos. The cold outside hit him like a wall. Snow crunched beneath his boots and the dim lavender light of early morning washed across the camp. Harold sprinted toward the stacked fuel drums, each one tainted by the loosened caps he'd sabotaged earlier. His breath tore out in ragged bursts. Behind him, voices shouted his direction. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, thick and hot. He crouched behind the drums and pulled out the fuse he'd smuggled in a tin of pepper. He worked fast, hands trembling but precise as they were when shaping dough under pressure. He wedged the fuse into place, targeted the weakest drum, and struck the flint. A spark bloomed, then smoke. The fuse hissed like a snake coiling to strike. Shouts rose in pitch, footsteps pounded toward him. Harold ran. He darted behind transport wagons, weaving through crates, slipping between shadows like an animal built for survival. His breath fogged the air. His legs felt carved from ice. Behind him, the explosion detonated. A roar tore through the camp, deep, hungry, earth-shaking. Fire surged upward, ripping apart the morning sky. The drums went up one by one, cascading in violent succession. A shockwave punched him in the spine, hurling him forward into the snow. He hit the ground hard, his ears rang. The sky shimmered in ribbons of orange and white. Men screamed orders, sirens wailed. Flames devoured the supply lines that fed entire German units. Harold pushed himself up on shaking arms. The satchel lay in the snow beside him, miraculously intact. He grabbed it, staggered to his feet, and pressed into the forest just as bullets snapped through the branches overhead. He didn't stop, couldn't, not with the forest shuddering behind him, not with flames chewing through crates and wagons, not with the knowledge that this single act could delay enemy operations by days. Snow swallowed his footsteps, smoke trailed behind him like the tail of a comet. He had done it, but the victory tasted bitter, metallic, heavy. And it wasn't over yet. Because the Germans were coming. And Harold still had to survive the forest long enough to deliver what he stole. Dawn crept slowly across the treetops as Harold Burns stumbled deeper into the forest, the stolen satchel thumping against his ribs with every desperate step. Smoke from the exploded depot drifted between the branches in long gray ribbons, carrying the smell of burning fuel, scorched canvas, and something darker, war's breath, thick and bitter. The cold gnawed at his fingers, his boots slipped on frost-slick roots. Every exhale came out ragged, like something inside him had cracked and was trying to escape. He wasn't thinking about tactics anymore. He wasn't thinking about the frying pan still tucked into his belt or the tiny decisions that had built up to this one impossible moment. He was thinking about survival, primitive, instinctual, hungry survival. Gunfire echoed distantly. German soldiers were sweeping the forest in widening arcs, hunting the ghost who had turned their morning operations into a firestorm. Harold kept moving, not in straight lines, never in straight lines, but in tight zigzags through thickets and creeks, choosing routes that dulled his tracks and broke the scent trail for dogs. He remembered tricks he'd learned from an old hunter behind the bakery in his childhood, tracking rabbits through brush near Huffman Prairie. Funny how lessons from a simpler world returned when the stakes were life and death. Hours bled together, his breath froze in his scarf, his legs burned. The satchel seemed heavier than any rifle he'd ever been forced to hold. Inside were papers, handwritten directives, supply schedules, maps annotated in sharp German script. He couldn't read all of it, but he didn't need to. Intelligence officers would. This was information worth risking everything for. Harold didn't know when he crossed back into friendly territory. He only realized it when a distant voice shouted in English, followed by boots rushing toward him instead of away. He barely managed to raise his hands before collapsing into a drift of dirty snow. When he woke, he was wrapped in blankets inside a canvas medical tent. A medic examined the bruise blooming across his ribs. Another cleaned the cuts on his hands. A captain, an American captain this time, held the satchel like a sacred relic. "You have any idea what you brought us, Private?" the man asked. Harold shook his head. "These orders outline the entire enemy supply posture for the next 10 days, the captain said. "This could save hundreds of lives during the counteroffensive." He paused. "How the hell did you pull this off?" Harold stared at his hands, shaking, raw, dusted with flour that still clung in the cracks of his knuckles despite the medic's scrubbing. "I just cooked," he whispered. The captain didn't laugh, he didn't mock the answer. He studied Harold like a puzzle that shouldn't exist but somehow did. Word spread quietly through the division. No announcements, no medals, not yet. The army didn't publicize missions that weren't supposed to exist. Instead, Harold returned to kitchen duty the next day as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that simmered beneath the surface of his thoughts long after the snow melted from his coat. He had captured a German officer, he had crippled a supply line, he had survived a manhunt, and he had done it all without ever firing a shot. The war marched on. The Battle of the Bulge began its brutal churn. Harold participated in none of the firefights, and yet he felt their weight every time he watched soldiers eat meals he prepared, knowing he had bought them time, hours, days, breath. He kept infiltrating supply positions when asked. 3 in total, each more dangerous, each more surreal. He slipped into a rail yard disguised as a maintenance helper. He swapped ration labels in a warehouse near Liege, triggering logistical chaos that delayed enemy reinforcements by 2 critical days. He guided a lost American platoon out of a fog-swept valley using nothing but a lantern, a bag of flour to mark quiet trails, and the reckless hope that he was heading the right direction. By spring of 1945, the war's momentum had shifted. Harold returned home on a transport ship full of exhausted men. Some talked endlessly, others spoke not at all. Harold existed in the quiet middle, grateful, haunted, changed. Dayton felt smaller when he stepped off the train, quieter. He visited the old bakery, now shuttered but still smelling faintly of yeast if he pressed his nose against the wood. His mother cried when he returned. His father, thinner and older than Harold remembered, simply nodded. It was enough. He tried telling the story once to a neighbor who asked what he did overseas, but the words sounded impossible even to his own ears. A cook who sabotaged depots, a frying pan fighter, a man who saved a platoon with flour, it all sounded like myth. But Harold knew the truth. War had transformed him not into a soldier forged by gunfire, but into something subtler, stranger, and harder to categorize. a man who'd weaponized invisibility, a man who'd turned kitchens into battlegrounds, a man who proved that not all victories come from the barrel of a gun. Years later, when asked what he remembered most, he didn't speak of the explosions or the fear. He spoke of the silence in the forest after the firestorm, the moment he realized that sometimes the smallest, quietest people could carry the greatest weight. And that sometimes war is won not by force, but by the hands steady enough to shape something fragile in the middle of chaos. If you want more stories like this, forgotten heroes, impossible missions, and the hidden corners of history, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and share the documentary with someone who loves a story that shouldn't be true but is.